Hey everyone, before we dive into this wild story, please hit that subscribe button to join our channel for more gripping tales like this one. Your support keeps these stories coming. The ballroom shimmered under 1,000 crystal chandeliers, each catching the light like stars trapped in glass. I stood at the edge, my borrowed gown clinging to my skin, feeling like an imposter among the elite. The waltz began, a swirling tide of silk and wealth, and I was pulled into its current. My partner, a kind-eyed stranger, guided me with a gentle hand, but I felt eyes on me. Not just any eyes. His. The trillionaire, Marcus Vane, stood across the room, his gaze sharp as a blade. He was the kind of man who owned the air everyone breathed. I tried to focus on the music, the violins weaving their spell, but his stare burned. Then, he raised a finger, pointing directly at me, his voice cutting through the melody. "She doesn't belong here," he declared, and the room froze. Every face turned, their judgment heavy, but I wasn't about to crumble. I had a secret they didn't know, and I was ready to use it. The silence was deafening, a weight pressing against my chest as I stood in the center of the dance floor. Marcus Vane's words hung in the air, each syllable a challenge I couldn't ignore. My heart raced, but I kept my chin high, meeting his gaze with defiance. I wasn't born into their world of private jets and diamond-encrusted lives. I'd clawed my way here, invited by a fluke, a favor from a friend who knew someone who knew someone. The crowd murmured, their whispers like a swarm of bees, stinging my confidence. My partner's grip on my hand loosened, as if he, too, doubted my place. But I wasn't just some nobody. They didn't know my story. I'd spent years in the shadows, learning their secrets, their weaknesses. I stepped forward, my heels clicking on the polished floor, and the room held its breath. I was about to turn their world upside down, and they had no idea. Marcus Vane's smirk was a weapon, designed to unravel anyone who dared stand against him. He leaned against a gilded pillar, his tailored suit a second skin, exuding power. I could feel the crowd's anticipation, waiting for me to falter, to prove him right. But I'd faced worse than a billionaire's tantrum. I'd survived a life they couldn't imagine. My mother's voice echoed in my mind, "Never let them see you break." I straightened, my gown catching the light, and took another step toward him. The waltz had stopped, the musicians frozen, their bows hovering over strings. I wasn't here to dance anymore. I was here to fight. My lips curled into a smile, one I'd practiced in front of a cracked mirror years ago. "You're wrong, Marcus," I said, my voice steady, loud enough for all to hear. The gasps were audible, a ripple of shock through the elite. I was just getting started. His eyes narrowed, a predator sizing up prey, but I wasn't afraid, not anymore. I'd spent years studying men like him, their egos as fragile as the champagne flutes they held. The room was a chessboard, and I was no pawn. I'd come prepared, armed with knowledge that could shatter his empire. "You don't know me," I continued, my voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The crowd parted as I moved closer, their faces a mix of curiosity and fear. Marcus's smirk faltered, just for a second, but I saw it. I knew about the deals he'd buried, the secrets he thought were safe. My friend, the one who got me the invite, had slipped me a file, documents that could ruin him. I hadn't planned to use them, but he'd forced my hand. The air crackled with anticipation as I stopped a few feet from him. This was my moment, and I wasn't backing down. "You think you can waltz in here and judge me?" I asked, my tone sharp but controlled, every word deliberate. The crowd was a blur now, their faces fading as I focused on Marcus. His wealth couldn't shield him from the truth I carried. I'd grown up in a world where survival meant outsmarting those who thought they were untouchable. The file in my clutch wasn't just paper, it was power. It held proof of his offshore accounts, the bribes, the lies that propped up his empire. I didn't need to shout. My calm was more dangerous. "I know things about you, Marcus," I said, letting the words sink in. His jaw tightened, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. I was no longer the outsider, I was the one in control. The game had changed, and he wasn't ready for it. The Trillionaire's composure cracked, a flicker of unease in his steely eyes, and I savored it. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like me. The crowd leaned in, their whispers silenced, hanging on my every word. I reached into my clutch, pulling out a single sheet of paper, its edges worn from my nervous fingers. It was a summary, just enough to tease the truth without revealing it all.
"This," I said, holding it up, "is why I belong here."
The room gasped again, their eyes darting between me and Marcus. He stepped forward, his voice low, menacing. "You're bluffing," he said, but I heard the doubt. I wasn't. The paper listed a single transaction, one that tied him to a scandal he'd buried years ago. I didn't need to read it aloud. The threat was enough. The power dynamic shifted, and I felt it in my bones. Marcus's face was a mask, but I could see the calculations running behind his eyes. He was weighing his options, deciding how to play this unexpected move. I didn't give him time to recover. "You built your empire on lies," I said, my voice carrying to the farthest corners of the room. The elite, his so-called peers, shifted uncomfortably, their loyalty to him wavering. I'd spent years scraping by, learning how to read people, how to find their cracks. Marcus was no different, just richer. The paper in my hand was my weapon, but my real strength was my story. I'd survived a childhood of hunger, of loss, of doors slammed in my face. This moment was my revenge, not just against him, but against all of them. I folded the paper, tucking it back into my clutch. The room was still silent, waiting for my next move. I took a deep breath, the scent of expensive perfume and polished wood grounding me. Marcus stepped closer, his voice a hiss meant only for me. "You have no idea what you're starting," he warned, but I wasn't intimidated. I'd faced worse threats in alleyways and boardrooms alike.
"I know exactly what I'm doing," I replied, my eyes locked on his.
The crowd was a sea of held breaths, their fascination palpable. They didn't know the half of it, how I'd spent nights poring over stolen files, connecting dots no one else dared to. My friend's favor wasn't just an invite, it was a key to this world. I'd earned my place, not with money, but with grit. Marcus's empire was glass, and I was the stone. I stepped back, letting the tension build, knowing I held the upper hand. The musicians, sensing the shift, remained frozen, their instruments silent as the grave. I turned to the crowd, addressing them now, not just Marcus. "You all think you're untouchable," I said, my voice steady, commanding.
"But you're not."
I saw fear in their eyes, the kind that comes when secrets are at risk. Marcus's empire wasn't just his, it was theirs, built on the same lies. I'd come here to blend in, to observe, but he'd made me the center of attention. Fine. I'd use it. The paper in my clutch was just the start. I had more, stored safely where no one could touch it. My life had taught me to always have a backup plan. I met Marcus's gaze again, daring him to make a move. The room was mine now, and they all knew it. The silence stretched, a taut wire ready to snap, and I let it linger, savoring my control. Marcus's face was a storm, anger and fear warring for dominance. He wasn't used to losing, but I wasn't playing his game. I'd rewritten the rules. "You'll regret this," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. I smiled, not out of joy, but because I'd won this round. The crowd was still, their judgment replaced by uncertainty, maybe even respect. I'd come here as an outsider, but I was leaving as something else entirely. The waltz was over, but the night wasn't. I turned, my gown sweeping the floor, and walked toward the exit. The room parted for me, their silence my victory. I didn't need their approval, I'd earned my place, and they'd never forget it. The cool night air hit me as I stepped outside, the ballroom's heat fading behind me like a bad dream. My heart still pounded, but it was exhilaration now, not fear. I'd faced Marcus Vane and won, not with wealth, but with truth. The city glittered below, a reminder of the world I'd fought to enter. My phone buzzed in my clutch, a message from my friend, the one who'd gotten me in. "You okay?" It read, and I smiled. I was more than okay. I was unstoppable. The file I'd shown was just a glimpse, a warning shot to keep Marcus in check. I had more, hidden in a safe place, ready for the next battle. The elite might rule this world, but I'd just carved out my own space. I glanced back at the ballroom, its lights glowing through the windows. They'd be talking about me for years. The streets were alive with the hum of the city, taxis honking, lights flashing in the distance. I walked away from the gala, my heels clicking against the pavement, each step a declaration. Marcus's words, "She doesn't belong here," echoed in my mind, but they were hollow now. I belonged anywhere I chose to be. My childhood had been a maze of struggle, but it had forged me into something stronger than their money. The file in my clutch was my leverage, but my real power was my resolve. I'd learned to survive in a world that didn't want me, and now I was rewriting its rules. My friend's favor had opened the door, but I'd kicked it wide open. The Trillionaire had pointed at me, but I'd pointed back. And I wasn't done yet. I slipped into a quiet cafe, its dim lights a stark contrast to the ballroom's opulence. The barista nodded as I ordered a black coffee, my hands still trembling from adrenaline. I sat by the window, watching the city pulse, and pulled out my phone. The file wasn't just paper, it was digital, encrypted, stored where no one could touch it. Marcus's empire rested on secrets, and I had the key to unlock them all. I'd spent years in the shadows, working odd jobs, scraping by, learning how to outsmart those who thought they were untouchable. Tonight wasn't just a victory, it was a statement. I sipped my coffee, its bitterness grounding me. The elite would be watching me now, wary, maybe even scared. Good. They should be. I was no longer invisible. My mind replayed the moment Marcus's smirk faltered, the crowd's gasps, the silence I'd commanded. It wasn't just about the file, it was about me, standing tall in a world that tried to push me down. I'd grown up in a crumbling apartment, my mother working 3 jobs to keep us afloat. She taught me to fight, not with fists, but with my mind. Tonight, I'd honored her lessons. The paper I'd shown Marcus was a single thread, but it could unravel his entire empire. I hadn't planned to confront him, but he'd forced my hand. Now the elite knew my name, and they'd think twice before crossing me. I checked my phone again, another message from my friend, "You're a legend." I laughed softly. Maybe I was. The cafe's warmth wrapped around me, a shield against the night's chill. I thought about Marcus, about the fear in his eyes when I'd held up that paper. He wasn't invincible, and I'd proven it. The elite lived in their bubble, thinking their wealth made them untouchable, but I'd burst it. My life had been a series of closed doors, but I'd learned to pick the locks. The file was my master key, a collection of truths I'd gathered over years of watching, listening, waiting. Marcus wasn't the only one named in it. Others in that room had secrets, too. I hadn't planned to take them all down, but now I was tempted. The Waltz had been my stage, and I'd stolen the spotlight. The city outside hummed, and I felt alive. My coffee was half gone when I noticed a shadow outside the cafe window, a man in a dark coat, watching. My instincts kicked in, years of survival sharpening my senses. He didn't approach, just stood there, his face obscured. Marcus's doing, no doubt. I wasn't surprised. Men like him didn't take defeat lightly. But I was ready. The file was safe, and I'd memorized every detail. If he came for me, I'd be one step ahead. I paid for my coffee, leaving a generous tip, and stepped back into the night. The man was gone, but I felt his presence, a reminder that this wasn't over. I didn't care. I'd faced worse odds and come out on top. The Trillionaire had underestimated me, and he wouldn't make that mistake again. The city's pulse matched my own as I walked, my gown hidden under a borrowed coat. I wasn't running, I was strategizing. Marcus's empire was vast, but it had cracks, and I knew where to strike. The file detailed more than just his deals. It named names, dates, places. I'd spent years collecting those pieces, a puzzle only I could solve. Tonight, I'd shown just enough to shake him, but there was more to come. My friend, the one who'd got me the invite, had warned me about men like Marcus. "They'll crush you if you let them," she'd said. But I wasn't letting anyone crush me. The ballroom had been my battlefield, and I'd won the first round. The war, though, was just beginning. I reached my apartment, a small, cluttered space that felt like home despite its flaws. The file was safe, not here, but in a place only I knew. I kicked off my heels, my feet aching, and sank onto the couch. The night replayed in my mind. Marcus's finger pointing, his voice dripping with disdain.
"She doesn't belong here."
He was wrong, and I'd proven it. The elite might have their money, but I had something stronger, the truth. I opened my laptop, checking the encrypted folder where the Real files lived. Pages of evidence, years of work, all waiting for the right moment.
Tonight had been a spark. The fire was coming.
I closed the laptop, my resolve hardening. Marcus Vane would learn who I was. Sleep didn't come easily, my mind racing with what came next. Marcus wouldn't let this go. He'd come for me, one way or another. But I was ready. I'd grown up dodging danger, outsmarting those who thought they had the upper hand. The ballroom had been a gamble, but it paid off. The crowd's silence wasn't just shock, it was respect, maybe fear. I'd turned their world upside down, and they'd remember me. My phone buzzed again, another message from my friend. "They're talking about you everywhere." I smiled. Good. Let them talk. The more they whispered, the more my power grew. Marcus had pointed at me, but I'd pointed back, and my aim was true. This was my story now. Dawn broke, painting the city in shades of gold, and I felt like a warrior waking to a new battle. The gala was over, but the war wasn't. Marcus Vane's empire was a house of cards, and I held the wind. I showered, letting the hot water wash away the night's tension, and dressed in jeans, shedding the gown's glamour. The file was my weapon, but my mind was my strength. I'd spent years learning how to navigate their world, blending in, listening, waiting. Tonight, I'd stepped out of the shadows, and there was no going back. The elite would be watching, waiting for my next move. So would Marcus. I was ready to show them all what I could do. The Trillionaire had underestimated me, but he wouldn't again. The morning news was buzzing with whispers of the gala, though my name wasn't mentioned, yet. I knew it wouldn't be long before Marcus's team tried to spin the story. But I had the upper hand. The file was my insurance. I met my friend at a diner, her eyes wide with excitement and worry. "You really did it," she said, sliding into the booth. I nodded, sipping my coffee, feeling the weight of last night settle into purpose. The file wasn't just about Marcus, it was about the whole system, the elite who thought they were untouchable. I'd shown them they weren't. My friend leaned in, her voice low. "What's next?" she asked. I smiled, a plan forming. The waltz was over, but the dance wasn't. I was ready to lead. We spent hours in that diner, mapping out my next steps, her knowledge of the elite guiding me. She'd been my way in, but I was the one who'd taken the stage. The file was a weapon, but it needed to be wielded carefully. Marcus would be looking for weaknesses, but I had none he could find. My life had been a series of battles, each one teaching me how to survive. The ballroom had been no different, just a fancier fight. I'd shown the elite I wasn't invisible, and now they'd be watching. My friend scribbled notes, her pen flying as we planned. The file could take down more than Marcus, it could shake the foundations of their world. I was ready to make it happen. Back at my apartment, I checked the encrypted folder again, ensuring every piece was in place. The file wasn't just documents, it was a map of corruption, a web of lies that connected the elite. Marcus was the biggest name, but he wasn't alone. I'd spent years gathering this, risking everything to get it right. Last night, I'd shown just enough to scare him, but the real blow was coming. My phone buzzed, a news alert. A vague article about tensions at the gala, no mention of me. Good. Let them scramble. The longer they stayed quiet, the more time I had to prepare. I opened my laptop, drafting an email to a journalist I trusted. The waltz had been my opening act. The encore was coming. The journalist was skeptical at first, but I sent her a snippet of the file, just enough to hook her. She'd been chasing stories like this for years, and I was her golden ticket. We agreed to meet in a crowded park, far from prying eyes. I wore a hoodie, blending into the city's chaos, my heart steady now. The file was safe, but I carried a USB with a copy, just in case. Marcus's shadow from last night lingered in my mind, the man in the dark coat. He hadn't approached, but I knew he was a warning. I wasn't scared. I was ready. The journalist's eyes lit up when I handed her the USB. "This is huge," she whispered. I nodded. It was bigger than she knew. The park was alive with joggers and kids, a perfect cover for our exchange. I told her enough to keep her hungry, but not everything, not yet. The file was my leverage, and I wasn't giving it all away. Marcus would be watching, his empire mobilizing to silence me. But I'd learned to move faster, to stay one step ahead. My childhood had been a crash course in survival, and I was a straight-A student. The journalist promised to dig, to verify, to publish when the time was right. I trusted her, but not blindly. I had backups, contingencies, plans within plans. The waltz had been my first move, but the game was far from over. I left the park, my steps light, my purpose clear. Days passed, and the city felt different, like it was holding its breath. My friend kept me updated. Rumors were spreading among the elite, whispers about the woman who'd stood up to Marcus Vane. I stayed low, working from my apartment, monitoring the news. The journalist was building her story, piece by piece, and I fed her just enough to keep her going. The file was a ticking bomb, and I controlled the timer. Marcus hadn't made a move, but I knew he would. Men like him didn't let challenges go unanswered. I checked my security, my locks, my digital defenses. The man in the dark coat hadn't reappeared, but I felt him out there. I was ready for whatever came next. One night, my phone rang, an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, my instincts screaming caution. The message was short, a man's voice, calm but cold. "Back off, or you'll regret it." I saved it, another piece of evidence. Marcus was getting desperate, and desperate men made mistakes. I sent the voicemail to the journalist, along with another snippet of the file. The noose was tightening, and he didn't even know it. My apartment felt smaller now, the walls closing in, but I wasn't trapped. I was in control. The waltz had been my stage, but the world was my arena now. I opened my laptop, drafting my next move. The elite would learn what I was capable of. The journalist's story broke a week later, a carefully worded exposé that didn't name me but shook the elite. Marcus's name was front and center, his secrets laid bare. The article was just the start, a warning shot to show him I wasn't bluffing. Social media exploded, the city buzzing with speculation. I stayed in the shadows, watching it unfold. My friend called, her voice a mix of awe and fear. "You did it," she said. Not yet, I thought. The file had more names, more secrets, and I wasn't done. Marcus's empire was cracking, but it hadn't fallen. I checked my encrypted folder, ensuring every piece was still safe. The man in the dark coat hadn't shown again, but I was ready for him. The elite were scrambling now, their perfect world unraveling. I saw it in the news, the whispers, the sudden resignations. Marcus wasn't the only one exposed. The file had named others, and they were running scared. I'd spent years preparing for this, building my case, waiting for the right moment. The waltz had been that moment, and I'd seized it. My friend met me again, her eyes bright with pride. "You're changing everything," she said. I shrugged. I wasn't here to change the world, just to make it fairer. The file was my weapon, but my story was my strength. I'd faced Marcus Vane and won, but the fight wasn't over. I was just getting started. As the city settled into a new rhythm, I stood on my balcony, watching the lights below. The Trillionaire had pointed at me, called me out, but I'd made the room go silent. Now the world was listening. The file was still mine, its secrets a shield and a sword. Marcus's empire was wounded, but he'd come for me again. I knew it. I was ready. My life had been a battle, but I'd learned to win. The elite thought they owned the world, but I'd shown them they didn't own me. The waltz was over, but my story was just beginning. I'd carved my place, and no one could take it from me. The city was mine now, and I was ready for whatever came next. Thanks for joining me on this wild ride. If you loved this story, hit that subscribe button to catch more.